Now, this isn't something I usually do. And in all honesty, it doesn't fit the channel. I know that. But at this point, the channel is already dying, so you know what, might as well treat it as a personal repository for all my thoughts. So this thought is pretty interesting, and it's interesting to me, and it's the idea that the Cold War never stopped. Now, many people might consider that the Cold War was won once America reached the moon landing, and I've seen many people believe that, surprisingly enough. Some might think that the Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, or others might think that the Cold War ended with the rise of Gorbachev and his implementation of the Glasnost. It doesn't really matter. At the end, I think all these theories are wrong. And here's why. I think they're wrong because they don't understand the principle of the balance of power. Now, for those that don't know, the balance of power is, in political theory, this idea that there are always forces that keep each other in check. One good example is exactly the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the USA and its friends. These were two great powers that were keeping a balance of the world. It's not always necessary for there to be two powers. There can always be more. That's never really a problem in the world. And we can see a very good example of there being three of them and there still being a world out there in 1984. But that's a different tale. What I want to talk about is this. Once you understand the balance of power, you start to realize that there's kind of always been a split between West and Eastern powers. Now, sure, that doesn't always apply. That's very certain, especially if we go way back during the time of the Seamen and the Egyptians and the first treaty of law. That's the thing. It doesn't always apply to East or West, the same way third world countries weren't really third world, I guess. Anyway, I'm gonna have to explain that at some point, but not today. I think I've already explained it once, but not now. This balance isn't always East and West, but more recently, it kind of went in that way, and it's kind of been like this, and I find it pretty interesting. And this also makes me think that the Cold War never really ended. Hear me out. The balance of powers never really changed. It was always West and East even after 91. Okay? It was always the USA and another opposing force. Now, to consider that it was either Iran or Afghanistan as the other balance of power just because America was fighting them, it doesn't work. But Russia, the Russian Federation was always there. The idea is simple. Cold War never ended because the necessities for it to end were not there. Hear me out. If a certain member from the balance of power, if one country suffers a great loss, most of the time it usually just loses its position as a superpower in the world. It loses its status in the balance of power, and another comes in and fills the void. The thing is, that's not always true. Look at the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom lost its high position after World War II. That's it. It was not the losing of the American colonies which did hurt the British Empire. It was not the death of King George, which also kind of affected the empire. It was after World War II that the United Kingdom kind of lost their position in this whole grand scheme of things. And as much as they might try to reclaim it now, I'm sorry, that's never going back to that empire, unfortunately. So we can see that a great event doesn't always destroy the balance of power. One force does not always lose its position, because an event happens. And this is why I say that the Cold War never ended. Because even though the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore, the Russian Federation was. Boy, was it there. Now, of course, you can go through the policies of Gorbachev and see how they changed and how the Cold War also changed from what it was to what it is today. But that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't work mostly because To be frank, even when Gorbachev was doing the glasnost and the whole liberation and shock therapy thing was happening with Yeltsin as prime minister / president, whatever he was, it was still the Cold War, and it still continued. The death of the Soviet Union didn't bring the end of this balance of power between the West and the East, the United States and Russia, because Russia was still there. Look at it like this. And what was it? 91, 94, whatever, 94 I think it was, during Yeltsin's reign, that Russia invaded Chechnya to stop it from, succeeding from Russia. Which, if you're American, you probably are against successions in themselves after your whole Civil War part. They were there, and once with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, what happened on the other side? Yeah, sure, Yeltsin invaded Chechnya to keep it under his control in the Russian Federation, but what did the Western counterpart do? It expanded NATO into former Warsaw Pact countries. So, the aggression and the tension was always there. It wasn't as implied and as powerfully felt, I think it's a better term, as it was during the Cold War. But it was still there. The balance of power never really changed because there was nothing that came in the Soviet Union's place except Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union. It will be years before China reaches the point Russia is in, though that is another discussion. The idea is simple. Look at the whole thing happening in the world right now. NATO putting bases near Russia, Russia invading other parts of the world to liberate their compatriots, I guess. It all just plays into it. The Cold War never stopped, really. The Cold War was always going on. It just changed in scope. It was no longer this whole battle of ideologies that it was presented during the Cold War, as it's now just a battle of influence, of territory, in a way. I guess territory works if we're referring to the minds and hearts of people. I think that works better. It's no longer a war just based on land or territorial control, as much as it's based on the soft political power, the influence, the spread of love, in a way, shall we say. Love for one of the two countries that are currently fighting. It just never ended. The aggression was still there. Conflicts were still arising even before 2015. It just so happened that it wasn't presented as a Cold War anymore because, for all intents and purposes, for America, the Cold War ended with the moon landing. I hate it because I know there are people out there that think the moon landing was the end-all, be-all of the Cold War. It ended. We reached the moon, we defeated the Soviets. No, you didn't. You didn't. The Cold War is still going on. Just changed in scope. It just changed in its goals. Changed from a war of... Did it really change from a war of influence, though? Because right now it's no longer a question of democracy against communism, but who has the most friends? I don't know. I just really feel that this is the position we're in now in the world. The Cold War never ended because aggression and tensions were still there, are still there. They were even during the 90s. They're still here in the 2020s. So that's why I think the Cold War never ended. It's still a proxy war at the end of it. It's no longer communism against democracy. It's influence. Look at Kosovo for an example. Russia was opposing the whole bombing of Kosovo that happened. But in the end, it still went on to the peace talks with its own influence. Russia opposed the integration of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in NATO, and also opposed the further integration of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And that was in 2004, I guess. Yeah, 2004. It always tried to pretend to be close to the West, but it also opposed the West. And the West also tried to pretend it's close to Russia, and it always opposed them. At the end of the day, they were always at each other's throat. The fear was there, the fear of the Cold War. And I guess in a way, back then, I guess during Bush's and Putin's meeting in 2007 or something, the idea that they were still in a Cold War situation is still daunting upon them. Though nobody refers to it as the Cold War. As I said, Americans, for all intents and purposes, many think they won the war during the moon landing. Which is false. Which is totally false. The enemy never really died out in either cases. The enemy wasn't really defeated. The enemy just continued existing. It went through a crisis and it came back, and the balance of power is still there. It didn't really change since the ending of World War II. The balance still weighs between America and an Eastern power that was once the Soviet Union and is now Russia, its successor. So at the end of the day, that's it. That's the end of it. The Cold War never ended. What we see now in Ukraine is just a continuation of the Cold War. It always has been. There is a comparison that can be made between America's war in Vietnam, the Soviet Union's war with the Mujahideen, sponsored by the West, the Korean War. You can go on and on about the influence and how the Ukraine war is similar to those. And in a way, it kinda is. One country fights another because the other doesn't want to do what they want, and the other country is sponsored by the enemies of the attacking country. Of course, the nuances of things are of course different between the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan back then, the war in Ukraine right now. There are things that are changed, but in the grand scheme of things, the skeleton is the same. It remains the same. And maybe that's why I think that in the end, no matter who wins, there's gonna be no real winner. Not for people like us. I don't know, I'm just beating the hills to turn a Romanian phrase into English.